I was instructed to put together a few slides just about my trajectory from being an academic scientist into the private sector. So I just threw together a few things that sort of illustrate what what the path I've taken, and so I'll just kind of walk through those and tell that story for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can open it up to Q&A. Okay, yeah. So this is basically the trajectory I took through institutions. I did my undergraduate degree focused mainly on molecular genetics in the lab as my focus at the University of Wisconsin. And I started working in the lab in my second semester, and to compress this greatly, more or less just fell in love with laboratory science from day one. So I did 5 years at undergrad, and from the second semester, very, very early on, I sort of knew that that was the path I wanted to take. And so I think I started to construct my entire identity around this. There was simply no question in my mind I was going to do a PhD and just become a scientist. So that's a great relief in many ways, because then I don't have to think about what I want to do, right? That's sort of, I guess, what you're trying to do as an undergraduate. I'll assume if everyone here is a PhD student, something like that probably happened to you at some point. And so then I went to Harvard for my PhD doing systems neuroscience research. And I would say approximately for the first half, I maintained that kind of monastic, almost religious devotion to doing science. And as is not uncommon, certainly by my fourth out of my 5 years there, I sort of lost that devotion, and for different reasons decided eventually that I probably wasn't going to do a postdoc and I wanted to go in the private sector. And there's lots of reasons for that. Many people, for better or worse, will have to go through that kind of transition simply because there's orders of magnitudes more of you than there are positions that can accommodate you. That's perhaps something we can talk about later on. So a lot of people, don't go on to do a postdoc or go on to do a postdoc, but then don't go on to a tenure track position. And eventually, many people go into the private sector. So I think I'm supposed to sort of talk about how I did that and what it entailed. And for me, it was, I guess it went more or less like this. So certainly by my fifth year, and in my fifth year, as I was finishing my PhD, I knew definitely wasn't going to do the postdoc. And I thought, well, what should I do? What do I want to do? And at this period of time, it's usually quite it's quite anxious, or I didn't know what I wanted to do anymore, like I did going into the PhD. And so there's this sort of like lack of direction and some angst that comes with that. But I thought to myself, well, a lot of my peers in the last couple of years had gone into data science, what you would call data science broadly speaking, going to places like Google or Facebook or whatever, into the tech sector, or into AI research or into other things. And I knew that was one sort of path. One of the hard skills I did learn in graduate school that I didn't have as an undergraduate was, programming and quantitative analysis. And so I knew that those were hard skills I should probably leverage and grow further. And I knew, so this is 2016, and at the time, this is 4 or 5 years ago now, and not as many states had legalized cannabis yet as have today. And so that industry wasn't quite where it was. It was still very, very much an embryonic form at the time. And so I noticed that space was sort of interesting and growing. At that time, right, I think you had Washington, Oregon, Colorado, maybe a handful of other states with medical state legal medical cannabis programs, but it wasn't like it was today. And so there was really just like one tech company in that space, and that was Leafly. I had been introduced to Leafly at one point while I was in graduate school because um, I brought some weed home one night, and because I did not buy it in a dispensary where it was labeled and branded and all of that, I didn't really know what it was. I was simply told what it was. And the person I was with, I said the name of the strain or whatever. So the person I got it from said this, I'm just going to make up the name. I don't remember what it was. This is White Widow. And I was like, I guess this is a White Widow, but I had never, that was never a salient feature of the plant to me because right in a state of prohibition, it doesn't matter. You're at the mercy of what the person you get it from says it is, and you have no way to verify these things. But of course, if you've had experience with this plant, you know that every time you encounter it, not every time, but many times you encounter it, it can smell different, it can look different, it can taste and potentially even feel different. So there was always this sort of mystery around cannabis because it's clearly highly variable and diverse. And everyone who was around it or consumed it at all in the era of prohibition knows firsthand many of the legends and the mythology and the language that sprouted up to try and make sense of that diversity without having any true tools of verification to do it. Right. So when you're younger, when I was younger, there was a bunch of myths that me and my friends had around, what made some cannabis better than others. Some people were convinced it was the lighter, whiter colored buds. Some people were convinced it was the red hairs and how red they were, et cetera, et cetera. But anyways, so I bring this bag of weed home with me, and I say the name of the strain, and the person I was with goes, "Oh yeah, this one's going to feel blah blah blah," looking at their phone. And I was like, well, what are you looking at? And then they had the Leafly app on their phone. And for you, those of you that don't know, Leafly started as an app for cannabis strains. So the people that started in Southern California, I believe, and they moved to Washington. But at the time, one or multiple of them were medical cannabis patients back when it was only medically legal. You would go into a medical dispensary in California, and there would be dozens and dozens or more of all of these different strains that have all of these weird names. Blue Dream, Granddaddy Purple, Girl Scout cookies, et cetera, et cetera. And allegedly, if you go into one of these stores, if you've never been into one, this is what will happen. You'll have someone called a bud tender, which is a cute term for someone who's usually in their early 20s that likes to smoke weed, and this is their job. And they will tell you very confidently how all of these different strains will affect you. And they'll have very distinct effects, and the type of strain it is and the name it has tells you something about the effects. So we can get into that stuff more and more. But it's like, okay, all of this is just sort of pseudo factual mythology that people have to create a language around this stuff in the absence of having access to real information. So, anyways, I learned what Leafly is through that kind of experience, and it's on my radar. And I think it's sort of interesting. They're sort of crowdsourcing the effects of the strains because that's the only way you can get this kind of information. If you smoke Blue Dream or something, you go on Leafly and you say, what did it smell like? What did it taste like? What did it feel like? So it was a tech company amassing this sort of crowdsourced data set related to cannabis that I thought was very interesting. And it was one of the only tech companies there at the time. So, anyways, I'm finishing my PhD and I want to go into something maybe to do with data science in the cannabis space because it looks like a good area of growth that's very interesting that I have some connection to. I've always been fascinated with what the chemistry of that plant was and what the actual logic of it was. And so I thought to myself, well, it's an industry that I'm not just going to go be a data scientist at Facebook or something like all of these other people. I want to do something a little bit more unique. I'm very interested in cannabis and plant chemistry and the nature of psychoactive drugs. So the industry is sort of doubly interesting for that reason. And I know of this tech company that seems fairly young. So I'm going to try and find that company. So what I did was, while I was still writing my thesis, I just went, I spent $30 or whatever to go in Boston to some local like medical cannabis industry conference thing. And I went there specifically because it was happening, but also because I could see that the VP of marketing at Leafly at the time was there at a panel discussion. So I just thought, well, I'll go to this panel and then afterwards I'll see if I can talk to this guy. And that's exactly what I did. And I just sort of got lucky. And long story short, that company was owned by another entity that owned multiple companies in the space, and I was aware of this. And so I got to talking to that person. I ended up doing interviews at Leafly and at this other company called Tilray, which was actually making cannabis strains and distributing them out of Canada. And I ended up taking the job at Leafly, long story short. So I guess the point of all of that is I sort of identified this maybe kind of sort of the direction I wanted to go. I narrowed it down to an industry, and then I just basically started looking for any possible way I could find to actually talk to a human being that had some decision making capabilities. And there's really no secret to that except grit, I suppose. And then luck. And then I got lucky, right? I was in the right place at the right time, and you can't control that. You can only control the first part of that. You can't control the second one, but you still need both. So anyways, so Leafly, if you were to go to it today, you would see something like this on the strain pages. There's a bunch of different cannabis strains. They all have these interesting names. They all have these categorizations, sativa or indica. And, a bud tender will tell you, take an indica if you want to fall asleep, take a sativa if you want to be energetic. And so all of these things have kind of become ingrained in the psyches of everyone who goes and buys and uses these products. And what do I have next here? So this is sort of the logic of the cannabis industry, and it was really born out of, like I mentioned, a lack of true data and information being available in a state of prohibition. So the plants are visibly different, right? Everyone can literally just see that with their own two eyes. Some of them are taller, some of them are shorter, et cetera, et cetera. And so the folklore that evolved from that and the set of constraints that people had was, well, I mean, the ones that look different, that must have something to do with how the feelings are different between them. So the mythos is that the shorter, stouter plants, often the indicas, will make you sleepy, and the taller, thinner plants, often the sativas, will make you more energized or uplifted. Coincidentally, there's this really interesting like multimodal correlation there, right? Like, oh, the short ones lower to the ground make you couch locked or relaxed, and the tall ones that are up higher in the air are the ones that make you uplifted. So it's a very sort of natural meaning that you would impose onto this if you had no other information. But of course, I don't know what your guys' background in the room is, but as a scientist, I look at this and I say, well, this is a chemistry problem, right? The way it makes you feel is going to be a function of its chemistry. And so if this mythos that the industry has created is in fact true, that must mean that there's some very clear organizational logic, some correlation between the chemistry of these plants and the way they look. And so knowing that I was inside of Leafly and that I was connected to some other companies, I thought to myself, well, this is actually quite a straightforward problem. All you have to do is go to one of the many legal cannabis testing labs that's amassing all of that data and measuring all of that chemistry, and you just have to look at the data from them and do a series of analytical things one would naturally do with a data set like that, and you could really just figure it out. What is the chemical logic of this space, and how does it map to all of these labels that the industry's come up with? And I realize I'm probably already going to be talking too long. So very long 5-year story short. What I did was I initially got in and I sort of had this grand vision. It's like, okay, I'm going to start working with the labs. I'm going to deconstruct the chemical logic of commercial cannabis. I'm going to use that to power things like recommendation algorithms at Leafly and completely recategorize the products in a chemistry first way. And that'll just have more predictive power for the effects that they can have with you and the medicines you might develop from them and whatever. So I was really sort of I wanted to map out the chemistry of this landscape and just sort of use that as my springboard to do all these other things, both at Leafly and potentially some other applications. And so the first thing I did as a young and naive academically minded person is I just called some of the labs on the phone and I said, I think this would be super interesting. Can I have your data, please? And then basically people either laughed or told me to fuck off because no one's just going to give you all of their IP. As I quickly realized was obvious. So at the same time, so then I just ran into this block right away. I couldn't get the data I needed. And at the same time, I was starting to learn just from being in the industry, some of the sad facts, which are people are hyper-focused on the THC percentage. People care very much about maximizing the THC they're getting per dollar they spend. So there's this incentive, this economic incentive in the industry to provide and sell the highest THC percentage products you can, right? Because if you're just as a consumer, if you see two products on the shelf, two super lemon haze joints, and they're both $10, and one of them's got 21%, one of them's got 17% THC, which one are you going to buy? The 21% certainly feels like a much better deal. So that mindset sort of drives a lot of behavior across the supply chain, such that the growers want the highest number they can get on their label because the retailers will sell that one faster and therefore buy that one from them first. And then of course, the labs will get more testing business if they produce numbers that are more favorable to the producers. So long story short, I started to like learn that that was like maybe a thing. And I took advantage of Washington's laws. I did a FOIA request to get all of the potency data from all of the labs in Washington. And by chance, this guy named Michael Zurab, who might still be at Harvard, he was at the Kennedy School as an economist, I believe. He had reached out to me asking to do some studies on some other things, and I unfortunately couldn't help him with that. But I had this interesting data set that I had just gotten. So Michael and I sort of analyzed and scrutinized data from all these labs, and we could see very clearly in quantitative terms that there were these differences between labs, and it gave me a template for determining who I thought was actually accurately measuring the cannabinoid levels and things from these products. So if you want to check that paper out, you can just look it up through the normal mechanisms. That was basically, and then basically after I did that study, I now had a way I could actually get data from labs, because in Washington, I could go to the lab that I thought was the best and say, I'm not just coming to you and asking for your data. I can actually show people that I think you guys are the best lab from a data integrity point of view. And I got up in front of people in sort of semi-public forums that were in the industry and said that in front of them and their competitors and all of their clients and things. So that lab gave me some data that I could study, and I started to dissect it, and I sort of used that to just keep doing that, lab by lab, state by state. So I can actually screen the labs and determine if I believe their data before I work with them. And again, long story short, I went through this sort of 2-year process where I established a bunch of these relationships with cannabis testing labs via Leafly. So sort of Leafly is pseudo integrated with these labs such that we take in the data, I can study that data, and we can use it to power things like recommendation algorithms and come up with new ways to visualize these products for consumers. But after I sort of amassed enough data, I don't know about you guys or what kind of work you're doing, but I spent 5 years in graduate school teaching, n equals 6 mice to do something kind of interesting, and eventually got a paper out of that. Here we're talking about tens of or hundreds of thousands of data points that are highly multidimensional that I can get in a much shorter amount of time. And that paper that I published from earlier on at my time at Leafly, that's been cited, I think, probably 3 or 4x the paper I did for my thesis, and I did it in less time with way more data. But anyways, now that I had this sort of giant mass of data in hand, I could sort of do what I wanted at the beginning and really sort of dissect and map out what the sort of chemical logic of this space was. And this is not really a data talk, so you can go read the preprint if you want. We're trying to get it published right now, and I'm remembering how much I hate that process because it's completely and utterly broken in every possible way. But we keep sending them papers and paying their fees, so they keep doing it. But anyways, we sort of dissected the chemistry of flower, commercial flower in North America, and we found more or less that the sativa indica hybrid categorization scheme really doesn't do very well at all at explaining the actual chemical diversity out there. However, some of the strain names are, to some extent at least, somewhat indicative of the chemistry of the underlying products, and so we spend something like 10 figures sort of mapping that out in detail in this preprint. And you could understand, usually I probably don't have to sell to this kind of audience as much as I do people in the private sector, the simple but powerful idea that, right, once you understand the chemical logic of this space, that can empower you in many other ways that are commercially relevant. So anyways, one of the things I actually do with that data, so like what do I actually do? I don't just write papers for journals. I sort of have to do that in my spare time. One of the things we do is we integrate both the crowdsourced data that we have at Leafly, the user reviews, and this lab source data about the actual chemistry, and we can sort of combine those two things in different ways to power things like recommendation algorithms at Leafly. So when you see, if you go to the gelato strain page, gelato just being a very popular strain, you'll see some of the basic stats associated with that name, and you'll see strains similar to it as determined algorithmically. And so a lot of those data partnerships and stuff that I built and those relationships that I put together allow us to acquire data sources that power those types of tools on the platform. Something else I do a little bit is I work with the content team. So I started recently doing a monthly science column on Leafly more or less focused, I would say, on the relationship between humanity's relationship with psychoactive drugs in different ways. So this is the first article that I wrote in that series. I think the second one's coming out next week or something, and that comes out once a month. News and content is another big component of Leafly, so that's how I tie into that part of the business. And the column is really based on a podcast I started last year called Mind and Matter. And so one of the other things I'll spend just a few minutes talking about before we take questions is how I did that. So in December of 2020, so almost 1 year ago, I decided I would start the podcast. And the reason for that was I had been working at Leafly for 4 years at that point, and also COVID started happening, and so as part of COVID, we got like every other Friday off, and plus I wasn't commuting to work at all. We went fully remote, so like I had all of this sort of extra time that COVID gave me, and I didn't want to just sit around doing nothing. I wanted to try and build something new, simply because I had that time, and I believed I should fill it with something productive, I guess. But also because I wanted to build some kind of like independent life raft. And there's different reasons I had for believing that, but I think a lot of people are doing that now. I think it's no longer a secret that it can be done. And this is sort of what the decentralizing power of the internet does, is it allows you to sort of build one thing that you can sustain as a business, potentially all by yourself. So anyways, I just decided I was going to do it, and I really committed to it. So I spent some money to work with a design friend of mine on the branding. I committed to doing it once a week, and sort of, maybe one of the lessons here is I had no real plan besides that, in some ways. Similar to the way that at some point I committed that I was going to try and go into cannabis and do data science stuff when I was still finishing my PhD. I just committed to this idea, and then if you truly commit to it, you simply will figure it out. So I just started basically cold calling people to come onto my podcast. I saw who was on other podcasts that maybe wasn't so famous that I had a chance that they would respond to me. And also I realized that there's so many interesting scientists doing interesting work that virtually no one outside of their little bubble has ever heard of. So it's trivially easy to just email the senior author on whatever paper you find fascinating and get them to talk about their work. I mean, you guys all probably know firsthand, if you're a scientist and you're working on something and someone calls you on the phone and says, I think what you're doing is super interesting, would you be willing to tell more people about it? They're almost always going to say yes. So I just started doing like weekly podcast conversations about whatever the hell I found interesting. And we can talk about that more, but the podcast is called Mind and Matter. You can check it out at my website. Twitter's the place I'm probably most active on social media. And I recently started a Substack. All of it's basically the same overall entity. It's all about this. And so we can talk about that more. But I guess I'll just take questions. Yeah.
Sweet. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So I am going to let Lucas essentially be the moderator for these questions, and you guys can type questions into the chat or raise your hand if you want to verbally ask a question to Nick. I would like to start, though, by asking a question, since I have about 5,000 that we won't have time to probably get to today. But my first question is, what percentage, or if you could give like an idea of the content of what you did during your grad school, like research, and what was in your dissertation, how much of that mattered when you first got your job at Leafly, like to the people hiring you and to the work that you were directly doing? Was it like a direct overlap, or
0%?
Okay. Fantastic.
0%. And the reason for that is, so different things matter in different ways. And I'll just explain this to you very frankly, because I'm a truth-oriented person, and I think that's what's going to be useful to you guys. Why did I get the job at Leafly? It's basically because I had a PhD from Harvard. I think I had only sort of a cursory formal relationship to cannabis. I had done a couple public talks on it, and I knew about it from my own self-directed study, but it wasn't like my thesis was about the effects of medical cannabis and blah, 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 or endocannabinoid biology, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I studied feeding behavior in rodents. So yeah, I could sort of stretch it and be like, yeah, I studied feeding behavior, and feeding behavior is related to cannabis, right? But there was no real relationship there. And frankly, the people hiring me, weren't scrutinizing my papers and asking me those kind of questions. They wanted someone who appeared to be very competent and had their credentials that would seem to prove that. Um, and I was coming to them at a time when people with that background, those credentials were not coming to them. So I think it was a very validating thing for a startup at that stage of its life to have someone like me approach them, and also who had a lot of interesting ideas about what I could contribute. But yeah, I was not hired into a role. They just sort of hired me as me and literally told me to figure out what I wanted to do. And because I did figure it out, and I kept figuring things out in a way that actually helped the company, then I stayed. But it was not. It was very much not that I was recruited because I had some like cannabis specific background or anything like that. Um, I think the three things of my background that are relevant that have helped me um, are what would I say? So A, there's the credential itself. If you have a PhD, that's valuable. If you have a PhD from one of the most recognizable brands in the world, I'm going to use that term. We all go to school, but these are brands, these are businesses that we're talking about. Harvard is by some measures one of the largest and most profitable businesses in the world, and just like Apple has amazing brand recognition, Harvard does as well. That was the credential itself was very important. Two, I would say just the analytical skills, so problem solving skills in the abstract, but also just the ability to self teach and self teach things like computer programming. So when I was in graduate school, we all used MATLAB, which like no one outside of academia uses MATLAB. So I was like, okay, now that I'm at Leafly, I should probably teach myself Python or something. And so I took advantage. I made myself learn Python programming just through the projects I wanted to do at Leafly. But my ability to like do those have those analytical hard skills and be able to just like self-teach and self-direct, which is something I think hopefully you're learning in graduate school. That was very important. And three, I'll just call it communication, overall communication skills. So one thing that I do think is very important that you should hopefully be learning at graduate school is how to communicate across different communication channels and to different kinds of audiences, and to be able to sort of flip flop between each of those very quickly. So being very good at written communication, being very good at verbal communication, and being able to explain things to both technical and non-technical audiences. So those were all skills that I think I cultivated going back to college and through graduate school. But being able to, I mean, it might even, this might sound weird for me to say this. It might sound so obvious to you guys, but if you can write down on paper or digital paper a series of like logical arguments backed up with data for why someone should or shouldn't spend money on this project versus that project. That probably sounds trivial, but not everyone can do that. In fact, not a lot of people can do that in a compelling way. So, just the ability to think logically and rationally about how one should allocate their time and resources, especially if you can do that and also sort of distill technical stuff into language that a non-engineer or a non-data scientist can understand, because that's ultimately who's going to make the decision. Those things are very valuable. So if you have those kind of written and verbal communication skills, and you can kind of lean into the technical and the non-technical side of things, and be a kind of translator for people, that's very valuable. So what did I say? There's the credential itself. That just means finish the damn degree and get the credential. There's the whatever analytical hard skills you have, but let's just be honest here. The more quantitatively well versed you are, the more programming chops you have, the more valuable you're going to be. And then the communication side of it. But the analytical and the communication skills I learned had nothing to do with like the specific content of my PhD thesis. They were right. Those are skills you should probably be cultivating no matter what field you're in. And that way they translate, they can sort of translate into anything.
Great. I think David has a question, and I would just like to encourage everyone, even if you type your questions in the chat, to have direct contact with our invited guest. Even though this is the Zoom culture, I would like to kind of keep it as realistic as possible, almost as if we're all in the same room. So, David, go ahead.
Yes, I'm doing this. Oh. Sorry, I'm just getting feedback. Oh, my own voice. Okay, I'll leave.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. A nod. Okay. I was just wondering what that most useful computational skill was. I mean, you touched on it briefly with MATLAB, but I guess as someone who doesn't have a lot of programming experience but recognizes how useful it is, because that's one thing you hear consistently, is like, how did you come in to the PhD with a lot of computational? How did you?
No.
Yeah, I guess how did you make that transition? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, you really just have to force yourself. So I didn't have any programming background going into my PhD. I simply had to learn it in order to do the PhD. I don't think I'm particularly talented at it. I don't have any like special ability at it. I just sort of had to learn it. In fact, I would definitely say I was not as good as many of my peers were naturally at it. But then, when I went to Leafly into the private sector, I knew that the specific technology that I had been learning as a graduate student really wasn't used out there. So I forced myself to learn Python, which is much more common and in many ways easier to use, I would say. But I just forced myself to do it. There was no one watching me do it. There was no one giving me a quota or giving me direction. With the projects I was using for the lab data stuff, but also just doing analytic stuff internally at Leafly, I just made myself learn Python. There's no specific skill. It's really just the skill of being able to learn the programming itself. And very much like learning a verbal language, I think the only real strategy there is immersion.
Great, thank you.
So I actually have a question. So what were some of the challenges that you faced kind of transitioning from academia into the private sector? And, were any of those challenges things that were, kind of on your end that you felt were difficult for you adjusting, and that versus companies adjusting to an academic PhD being on their team? So yeah, it'd be great to hear more about that.
Yeah, there were challenges. Yes. Where do I even start? So again, just sort of the background context here is I basically decided, like, screw it, I'm going to go in this direction. I got a good job offer, or what I thought was a pretty good job offer at the time. That's another skill I've learned that you don't learn in your PhD program, is how to value things, and besides in glory or papers. But yeah, there were a lot of challenges. So I mean, from day one, I mean, literally, it's hard for me to emphasize this enough. I mean, day one, there was no rubric. I was not hired to do X, Y, and Z. I literally just had to make it up on the spot. So, I mean, that in itself is one thing. I'll get more specific in a moment, but there was no, it's not like when you join a lab and, you're probably given one of a few like projects that the PI has in mind, and you're going to be, surrounded by people that know this, that, or the other technique, and that you're going to learn those things. So there was none of that sort of direction there at all. No top-down direction. It all had to come bottom up from me. And so, I mean, right out of the gate, I was just like, okay, how can what could I possibly do that that is valuable to the company? And right away, there was a couple kinds of things, and I just experimented with both of them. I mean, one of them was just data and analytics, right? This is a company, they've got web traffic, they've got app downloads, they need to understand the analytics side of it. There wasn't a lot of sophisticated analytics going on at Leafly, so I sort of helped helped them get a better handle of their analytics just by doing very basic analytical stuff and reporting and learning how to sort of communicate data stuff to people internally. And then that was, sort of a corollary of that is like learning how to um, communicate stuff about numbers to people that don't know that don't have the background I had. So I'm not walking around talking about p-values all day. I have to talk in a different kind of way to the people that need to hear that stuff. So that the communication side of it was a bit of an adjustment, but not that terrible. In many ways, what's more challenging is just like you're swimming in so much data and numbers now, just all around in a tech company or just in general now that it's really easy for people in the company to tell whatever story they want to tell by just fishing for the right piece of data and sort of regulating that. That's actually a very big challenge, I would say, if you're working in a tech company or something like that. The people that have sort of the deeper quantitative background are always going to be in the minority, and you can't control all the information. There's just too many people working on too many things. That's tough. The other thing I did was I started working on content a little bit early on. And I'm doing that again now. So, they were hungry for more content. So I wrote some articles early on that other people couldn't write. I could sort of talk about the science of cannabis and CBD and all of these things in a way that a lot of other writers in the space couldn't. And I could also help other people like write those kinds of articles. So I sort of helped on the editorial side to some extent. But I guess the overall theme there was like, right, you've got the analytical hard skills, I'll call it, and you've got sort of the softer science communication skills. And I figured out how I could use both to just help the company with its needs at the time. I mean, I could spend a long time talking about this topic. Challenges to this day. I think communication is always a big challenge. Translating data insights to people and making them relevant, whether it's someone in a marketing department or someone who's an executive. I think that's always an ongoing challenge. And that's why I think the combination of like the analytical skill set and the communication skill set is so valuable. Convincing people, how do I say this? So in relatively speaking, right, in science, at least we like to think we are truth oriented. It's supposed to be an okay part of the culture, even though no one likes it, right? To be told that you're wrong, or to be shown that the really cool idea that you had isn't actually consistent with the data. Even that's a struggle in science. I think grappling with like the psychology of that. Everyone wants their ideas to be right. Everyone has their favorite theories. But like it's even more challenge. The psychology there is even more challenging in the private sector because people really want their ideas to be right because there's like a promotion or a bonus resting on it. And navigating that is really interesting. Learning to compromise and actually not. Here's another. This is actually one I should definitely mention. So it's a very different. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. There's a very different and lower sort of standard of evidence and quality in certain ways, the ways that you're probably used to thinking of like quality as a scientist. Like in theory, if you're working on a project and you're doing experiments and you're trying to get that Nature paper or whatever, right? You want all those experiments to be done very, very well. You've done them all many times, right? You want everything to just be tight and rock solid, and you want to be 100% sure before you send that off for publication or whatever. In business, you cannot do that. If you wait for everything to be 100%, it's too slow and you're going to fail. So learning to have a mindset of like, all right, we're not really sure if A or B is true, but we've got some directionality to it. Maybe we feel like we're 70% of the way there, and maybe we should go with A and not B, and then just going with it. And if you're wrong, it's fine. You can backtrack later. But like just having that mindset of you're not going to be as sure of things when you make decisions as you were in the lab. And so you have to be more nimble and flexible in that way. And sometimes you have to compromise. Like across the board. Everyone does all the time, but like you also need to compromise in the sense of like yeah, the group's going to make a decision, even though I don't feel like we really have a handle of what's going on. It's not as rigorous as I would have wanted it. You just do it anyway.
Great, thank you so much. So we do have a few other questions as well. So I believe Brian had his hand raised first. So we'll go Brian and then John and then Courtney. So go ahead, Brian.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Nick, for coming. When Courtney told me you were going to be giving a little talk here, I was pretty excited because I was listening to your podcast prior to that. So it's good to be able to talk to you. So with that being said, I just want to say on the topic of podcasts, because that's kind of how I found you. It feels like we live in this age of information where obviously information is just readily accessible at any time. And your podcast is a prime example of that new medium of information dissemination. Now, do you think that scientific and educational podcasts like yours will continue to become more and more popular? And you think it's the best method of trying to communicate science to both, like you mentioned earlier, people who aren't really in the field, essentially the layman?
I think the basic answer is that yes, yes, it will become more common. No, it's not necessarily the best way. It's just a better way than some alternatives now. I think what's happening across the board, and I'm borrowing these ideas from other people. It's not like I've come up with these ideas. You can see this across sectors, and I think it's literally going to happen for academia itself, although the dynamics will be different. Is you have this phenomenon of unbundling and rebundling that comes from the internet being what it is. So let's just take the music sector as an example, right? And we've sort of all lived through this. Right, it used to be that there was just a handful, like if I think of my parents, for example, when my parents were in high school, them and their friends and their peers all listened to more or less the same music. Because there was only 3 or 4 radio stations that everyone would have listened to the night before. When a new album comes out, everyone knows it comes out, and it's at the record store that everyone goes to. And so you've got everything bundled up in a certain structure, right? Songs come out one LP at a time. You buy them at the record store. There's a small number of radio stations, right? The number of channels and the way things are packaged has a certain structure, and it is what it is. Fast forward a couple of decades into the present, and now that structure has been broken in many ways, right? We sort of the internet just sort of like sprayed all of the individual songs onto the internet, both in the sense of like the early days of Napster, when literally you could just sort of pirate any song you wanted to, no matter what. And then there was some evolution and some pushback against some of that stuff. But basically on the internet today, right, you can go and get any individual song you want somehow. And then it's becoming rebundled into a new format. And that's things like, Spotify or Pandora, right? So now a kid today is much more likely, I think, to be listening to a playlist generated algorithmically on their Pandora app than they are to be, buying each new LP that some band is coming out with. Not that doesn't happen anymore, but clearly sort of the relative weight of these things has shifted. And that sort of unbundling, rebundling motif, you can see it happening elsewhere. So podcasting and journalism is another example, right? Cable news is literally dying. Like, yeah, it's still there, and grandma and grandpa are still watching, MSNBC or Fox or whatever. But if you just look at the numbers, right, fewer and fewer people are watching those big sort of broadcast TV stations or entities today, and everything's much more fractionated, right? The odds, if I just go pick a random person on the street today, what are the odds that person listens to the same podcast I do? Pretty damn low. But 50 years ago, we were all watching the same news on Friday night. So sort of technology has led to this unbundling and rebundling motif where sort of everything's getting ripped apart, and then it sort of gets repackaged in new ways facilitated by the new forms of tech that we have. And I think that's going to happen in academia as well, although the behemoth that academia is going to make it different from what happened in some other industries. So to one of the things that you said, right, essentially all of the information that you can get at any university is available online for free. That is remarkable. So you literally, like, it used to be that you had to go to university and get a degree if you wanted to really learn about like pick whatever field you want, molecular biology or history or whatever. Now you can literally learn about whatever the hell you want from people that are perhaps not quite as competent or credentialed as the university professors, but oftentimes, yes, like literally as credentialed, because it literally is those people, or close enough. Right? Some of the best teachers, like some of the best YouTube tutorials out there, are just made by people that you never heard of before, except that they have that YouTube channel. You know, and if you look what's very closely what's happening, right? You've got, I mean, there's plenty of scientists that are professors with labs at institutions today, and they also have a podcast, or they also are doing this other educational thing. So I think we're in the beginning of a kind of restructuring of academia. Academia is much more difficult to disrupt because it's literally hooked right into the government apparatus, and it's funded by tax dollars in a way that I think the other industries aren't. So I don't think it's going to sort of just play out the way that it has for other sectors. But yes, I do think podcast, I mean, it's just a fact. If you look at the numbers, podcasting is becoming more common. Independent journalism is becoming more common. I think that it's not going to, it's not like it's going to that, it's going to stay to that. That itself will evolve. So like, right, Substack right now is really interesting to me because you've got all these great independent journalists, and now they're doing stuff on their own. They're not going through these institutional filters that you have to go through at another institution. That's, you know, that's really interesting. You're getting kind of these unfiltered viewpoints, but it's all one at a time. It still is awkward, right? I don't quite have the Spotify algorithmic playlist for Substack yet. And then there's the credentialing. So today, right, I mean, the credentialing is monopolized by the university system. So two things are true simultaneously, right? If you get a degree, especially a degree from Harvard or Stanford, MIT, right? That's going to open doors for you that can't be opened even if you know all the same information that the person with that degree has, right? You can get all of your education from YouTube and the internet. You could be just as well versed in molecular genetics as the person with the molecular genetics degree, but because you don't have a credential that proves to someone, that's like a token that proves to someone that you have that knowledge, it doesn't matter in a way. It's not gonna do for you what that degree does. So I think what I would be really interested to see happen is some sort of new vehicle for credentialing that's much more merit based, that's much more that's not hooked into this sort of university industrial complex that requires people to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the token of knowledge that ostensibly proves to people that they have that knowledge. And to be frank, a lot of the college students being churned out of the university complex today don't actually have that knowledge. Like, I know people in my life that have degrees, and they basically can't do very simple things. So they learned like a bunch of sort of trendy and or esoteric pseudo knowledge, to be frank, in many cases, but they can't do the basic math that would require you to run a business. They don't have the basic reading and critical thinking skills required to evaluate a piece of writing. So there's this this giant sort of academic machine that I do think is ripe for disruption. I just don't know how it's going to happen because it's so hooked into like government money. But I do think it's inevitable because you simply, I'm sort of ranting at this point, but you don't need, in one sense, you don't actually need to go through that credentialing system anymore to acquire knowledge. You do need to go through it to actually ascend like the social status hierarchies and professional hierarchies that you want to. But it's very interesting to me now that you no longer need to go through that system to actually acquire knowledge. And I think new ways of bundling information, whether it's podcasting, other things, are going to continue to like come up and ascend. And somehow, some way, the whole sort of credentialing system is going to have to adapt to the technological landscape.
Great, thank you. And I think, John, you had a question. Go ahead.
Thank you for the very interesting talk, Nick, and a lot of interesting discussion on that last question. Actually, sort of following off on that conversation of credentialing, like I can think of a lot of things nowadays that have started up that are sort of putting out some feelers in that direction, like Skillshare.com or Khan Academy. Actually, Khan Academy last year started up an offshoot called Schoolhouse.world that's like, I believe, been trying to set up some knowledge certification programs that have official college affiliations to try and like give it some clout behind it. So be interesting to see if anything develops out of that.
Yeah. Is it
Any
Mark?
comments about that?
Oh yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. Like if you think of what a credential is functionally, what it should be,
Mhm.
It's really just a way of compressing a bunch of information about someone into, something that you can see or learn about at a glance. Like, right, if someone says, "I've got a degree in such and such field from such and such university," if that credential is doing what it's supposed to be doing, then you should be able to conclude with confidence, that person knows these facts and they can do these things. And I think that's becoming less true over time
Mhm.
with university degrees.
I feel like different credentials espouse different degrees of like knowledge versus skills. Like we're saying, the PhD is a lot about just the skills to fill in whatever knowledge you don't have, even if it's not something you previously had.
And so what's super interesting about that to me is to the extent it's true that we're seeing a divergence between the formal credentials in the form of university degrees that we're used to thinking about and the skills and knowledge that those credentials actually indicate are there. To the extent those things are diverging, then over time there's less and less information. The credential's like doing it's working as a credential less and less, right? Because it's not telling you any longer with high confidence what someone knows or what they can do. And this obviously is happening at different rates in different fields. When you think about sort of the economics and the private sector dynamics of this, anytime that you're hiring in a company, or even in academia, right? Anytime you're hiring a postdoc or whatever, what you're trying to really do in an interview is you're trying to spend as little time and effort as possible in order to figure out who can like do the thing you need to be done. So you look for honest signals of competence, and you don't want to spend a lot of time searching for this person because time is money. So a really good credential is one that, the perfect credential is one where you can be like, okay, that person has that piece of paper. They can definitely do it. Just hire them on the spot. You can't do, you can't do that today. I don't know if you ever could quite do it, but I guess my point is, if certain credentials like the ones that you mentioned can be developed that are like very reliable markers of specific things, such that, if someone uploads their whatever credential and it proves to me beyond a shadow of a doubt that like you can do X, Y, and Z, then there should be a natural gravitational pull towards that type of credentialing, because it's just going to save everyone else. It's going to be more efficient. It's going to save time and money to find the people that you need to do what you need them to do. So yeah, I definitely, I don't really know what to say beyond that, but I certainly look forward to seeing those types of things rise up, because I don't think the credentials we have today, I think they're losing reliability over time.
Okay, just to sort of reel it back into my original question, and I'll be brief because I know we're about out of time, but one of the major threads of your talk was about sort of how a lot of sort of folk knowledge arose around the cannabis industry during the prohibition, and sort of formed the basis of the more modern, more formulated analyses of these things. How do you deal with the sort of pushback or like the superstitious stubbornness from, I'm sure, many customers and even a lot of your business partners probably, to the old things that contradict with the more modern evidence?
Yeah. That's a tough one. It goes back to the other guy's questions about like challenges. A lot of times you don't. You kind of just suck it up, and you have to be resigned to certain things just being the state of the world. So some of these things are so ingrained and they're so simple that, there's just a lot of activation energy required to overcome them. So I actually sort of tried and mostly failed in a big way to sort of do this on a grander scale. So we came up with this whole new way of visualizing strains, like literally visualizing them based on their cannabinoid and terpene profiles, which took into account sort of the ratios of the principal cannabinoids found in them, like THC and CBD, and usually the three most prominent terpenes found in that strain. And just that many variables right there THC, CBD, 1, 2, 3 terpenes, like that number of things compared to just being told sleepy strains, energizing strains, it's too much information for most people most of the time, especially if they're trying to figure out how to spend their money on something that they just want to do for fun. So it's very, very difficult to distill something with this level of dimensionality and complexity into a simple narrative that is commercially contagious, if that makes sense. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I certainly haven't overcome it's right. It's not like people aren't using these same terms today. If you go into any dispensary anywhere on the planet today, the bud tender is going to tell you the indicas make you more sleepy, the sativas make you more energized. And the basic underlying justification for that is I smoke a lot of weed and that's what I tell everyone, and it seems to work. And I wish I had a better answer for you. It's really hard to overcome that. Part of my answer is, not getting hung up on trying to change and convince people all at once, because you'll just drive yourself crazy and stress yourself out. But just constantly, I've done some of the research that we've published that's like out in the world, and you sort of start to change the conversation slowly by talking about things differently, either through like content channels on Leafly, for example, and things like that. So I guess the answer to my question is you sort of you learn to make peace with how slowly some of these elements of human culture and language change, and how imperfect they're always going to be. You're never going to be able to convince people to convince the average consumer to to have the same level of rigorous understanding that a scientist would.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are closing into 2 p.m. Actually, we're a little bit beyond it. I'm very happy to stay. So I'll ask you the last official question. I'm sure you're very busy and probably have other stuff to do this afternoon. So after this will be officially ended. However, so my question is, so when you started at Leafly, it was a young company and the cannabis industry was small. And now it's by no means enormous, but it's certainly grown in the last 5 years. And I see it growing more and more. How do you anticipate that? So you said, basically your credentials were I have a PhD from Harvard, and what you did in your PhD mattered almost not at all to the people hiring you. As the cannabis industry grows, how hard is it going to be and how competitive is it going to be, do you think, for people like us with academic backgrounds to insert ourselves into that industry?
I really think it depends on, I think it'll depend more and more on what your specific hard skills are. So, you might not have specific background in cannabis, but if you are like a really good plant agronomist or plant geneticist, right, there's just going to be more and more demand for those people to work at like big companies doing like serious, genetics and breeding programs. So if you have those kinds of hard skills, I think it's relatively easy to get in. I think, right, the better you are with a computer, the better you are at programming quantitative analysis, there's going to be demand for you in all kinds of places. And it's really not gonna matter what the specific content of your background is. It's sort of like, I don't know, what would be a good analogy? It's like if I need a sculptor, I don't care what kind of clay you worked with before as much, or like, that you used to make sculptures of horses. I just need someone who can like sculpt clay. So if you can prove to me that you can sculpt clay, like that's what we need, if that makes any sense. So the specific hard skills you have are going to directly translate into your marketability in the private sector, more than like the intellectual content of your PhD. I think that's a fairly fair statement that I would say I'm confident in. Even with cannabis, even to this day, it's, I've been in the industry for 5 years. There hasn't been enough time for people to like go to college and focus on cannabis. Like there are programs and majors, I think, that are starting to do that now, but it's not like, right, it's not like there's a bunch of people out there with a PhD in cannabis, whatever. There's a few, but they're hyper specialized. And, you know, if I like, well, let me put it this way. Like if I'm like Leafly's a tech company in some sense, you know, the cannabis is like incidental. You know, you could know everything there is to know about the plant, but, you know, we need software developers. If you can't develop software, I mean, it doesn't really matter how much you know about cannabis to do the software development. You could be, you know, you could have some like crazy thesis you did on, you know, cannabis biochemistry, and it's like super hardcore biochemistry and it's cannabis. But, you know, if you're not applying for a position to do biochemistry, then, you know, it's like the sculptor analogy. It's like if you need to figure out like what do people need? What kinds of people do they need, and what do they need them to do? I think your skills. So thinking of yourself more like a trade person than an intellectual is maybe a better way to think about like where you're the most marketable, if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So